We have Mark Poles from the shop on the Borderlands. If you've never seen this online store, um, this is probably the biggest selection of RPG material, etc., that you're ever likely to find. He's got old stuff, new stuff, and everything in between. Mark, welcome to the show, man.
Hello, Warren.
So, Mark, what can you tell us? How did the shop on the Borderlands get started?
It sort of started following a sort of an insurance inquiry.
Hmm.
I used to be a massive collector, a massive RPG collector, in particular Traveller, the GDW science fiction
Yeah.
RPG. To the extent where for Traveller, I wanted everything. I wanted every printing of everything. I wanted unpublished manuscripts of stuff. So I was a huge collector. And that was funded because I had quite a well-paid job. But I lost that well-paid job, went to work for my wife, essentially earning a lot less money, and I could no longer afford to buy anything I wanted that I saw going on eBay.
Yeah.
And my wife said to me one day, you probably should get your collection insured. So I spent a weekend going through eBay and working how much it would cost to replace my collection if the house burned down or anything.
Hmm.
And to my surprise, it came out to like £30,000. My collection would have cost to replace.
Yeah.
And I did look at a couple of insurance quotes, and it seemed a little expensive. But my wife said, "Well, you miss buying the stuff. That could be a collection, or it could be opening stock."
Oh.
Oh
Yeah.
my.
Mhm. Yeah.
I couldn't sell my collection, but then, no, if you had your collection and we were selling stuff and buying stuff at the same time and so on. So that's how the idea got started. My wife's business was a web development business, and I did the online marketing side of things for that.
Mhm.
So between us, we had the skills to do an online shop.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, we could do this. And I must admit, so we created the shop on the Borderlands,
Mhm.
and it started pretty slowly.
Yeah.
I can remember our very first sale, which was a single book for £14,
Hmm.
and then we didn't sell anything else for 2 weeks. And at that point, I thought this is only ever going to be a sideline.
Yeah.
But it has snowballed since then.
Yeah.
That was back in 2014, so we've been around for 6 years now.
Yeah. It's interesting how time. It's not something you can buy. But it has a wonderful effect on businesses. You give them time, and some of them just start to flourish, and it can kind of then start to reach a tipping point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, we get a lot of return buyers, and I think probably spread through word of mouth.
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably the rationale for advertising and supporting Virtually Expo. Hopefully, there are people listening now who haven't heard of us.
Yes.
Who are now going to go and check out the website.
Yeah,
Of course.
absolutely. So the RPGs is, well, you stock a lot of stuff. Okay,
We do stock a lot of stuff.
RPGs seem to be like the core, the beating heart.
Yeah, I think
of
it
this.
reflects my tastes on, I'm a bit of an omni gamer,
Yeah,
but I'm mostly about the RPGs.
yeah.
Mhm.
So can you tell us about your passion of RPGs, and what has been your favorites, and just learn a
I
bit
probably
about you?
started like a lot of people of my age. I'm 48. But, and I suspect like a lot of people of that kind of age, I started with the old red box D&D basic set.
Yep.
Came in a really poor quality cardboard box with a player's guide and a DM's book inside and some dice.
Mhm.
And if you were lucky, you got a free adventure, possibly the Keep on the Borderlands, which is sort of where the shop gets its name from.
Yeah.
And I started playing that way, a bunch of friends, moved over to first edition advanced Dungeons and Dragons because
Oh
it
yes.
sounded more important than
Mhm.
basic. Who wants to play basic when you can
Yeah.
play advanced? And then, met other friends through that who were also role playing separately, and the groups came together. And through that, met a friend who played Traveller.
Mhm.
And I was into science fiction, loved Blake Seven and Doctor Who, and so science fiction role playing game. Yeah, this is cool. Really got into Traveller, really got into travel at university. Found more people at university, and it sort of grew from there. But then I left university, and I became a trainee chartered accountant. Now,
Yeah.
if you are a trainee chartered accountant, you have to do exams, and studying for the exams is really hard. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, all the people I knew at university who were playing games had spread around the country, so I sort of
Mm-hmm.
lost touch with being an active gamer.
Mm-hmm.
And the outlet for my gamingness, was collecting. So
Yeah.
I became a collector at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Now, since then I've got back in touch with a lot of those friends, and we play fairly regularly now. So I'm an active gamer,
Yeah.
but there was a period in my life, generally when I didn't have much time, when I was studying for exams, when I was a collector more than a gamer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of adventures that you've run, any standout ones that come to mind?
Stand out. I think that's two questions, because I
Mm-hmm.
think adventures. There's two types of published adventures.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, before I answer that question, I think I would make the point that I bet the best RPG adventure ever written has not been published, because most adventures ever written were been done by homebrew guys and only played it with their group, and it was fantastic, and it's never been published.
Yes.
But let's talk about published stuff, particularly as we're a shop. I reckon there's I want to distinguish between adventures
Mm-hmm.
and campaigns.
Yes.
So an adventure is something you run in an evening or 2 or 3 evenings,
Yeah, you
and
one
a
shots.
campaign is something that lasts for months or even years.
Yeah.
Adventures, the one I keep coming back to, and I'm inclined to run for my group and convert it to 5th edition soon,
Mm-hmm.
is an adventure called Irillion, which was published across 6 issues of White Dwarf, mid-80s, and is a first edition AD&D adventure set in a very detailed fantasy city. And it's all about chaos and dark rising, and it's difficult to describe why I think it's so great. Anybody who remembers Irillion, I think, will remember just how much the adventure is enhanced by the detail put into the fantasy city.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a big, thick thing. It's 6 magazine adventures, and it's very easy to run. Dig it out. It's available in the Best of White Dwarf Scenarios, Volume 3,
Mm-hmm.
which I admit that we do not have in stock at the moment, but that's probably the easiest way to get it.
Yeah.
Search for that on eBay.
Uh-huh.
As far as campaigns go, long-term campaigns, I was talking about this with your tech guy, Jerry,
Yeah.
and it turns out that we have the same idea for the best RPG campaign ever published,
Uh-huh.
which is quite a coincidence. My shortlist includes the usual stuff like Masks of Nyarlathotep for Call of Cthulhu and Horror on the Orient Express for Call of Cthulhu, The Enemy Within
Uh-huh.
for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I saw your chat to Dominic at Cubicle 7. Of course,
Yeah.
they're doing it for the new edition, and they're doing a really good job as well. Also, the Great Pendragon campaign for Pendragon is on my bucket list of RPG adventures or campaigns that I want to run, but I need to find the right point in my life because it's huge. It
Yeah.
lasts for like 70 years game time.
Oh.
But my number one, and I have run this, and my group absolutely adored it, is a campaign, a big thick campaign for Call of Cthulhu called Beyond the Mountains of Madness,
Uh-huh.
which is it's a follow-up to a Lovecraft short story, or Lovecraft novella, I think, called
Mhm.
At the Mountains of Madness, which is all about a Miskatonic University expedition to the Antarctic that discovers horrific things, mythos horrors, and people go mad. It's Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah.
And 10 years later, the university is sending out a follow-up expedition, and the player characters are members of that follow-up expedition, along with about 80 other NPCs.
Mhm.
And it's hugely detailed. It's quite linear, but that somehow doesn't seem so bad when you play it. Rather like the way that, if you've ever written Moby Dick is actually, as well as being an adventure story about hunting a whale, is full of stuff about 19th century whaling and technology used for whaling.
Yeah.
Beyond the Mountains of Madness has lots of stuff in it, lots of detail about 1930s Antarctic exploration.
Yes.
And that sounds like it should be quite dull,
Oh,
but
no.
actually that's part of the adventure, is coping with the environment.
Yes.
And I loved that. There's a really good one of my favorite moments in any RPG adventure is fairly near the beginning. The expedition ships arrive in Antarctica. They haven't reached land yet. So they're threading their way through the pack ice, and a wrecked ship or a lone ship is spotted stuck in the ice. So the player characters, being player characters, go off in a rowing boat to explore and examine this ship. And being Call of Cthulhu players, they're clearly expecting that there's some mythos horror, and this is how we're going to get introduced into the adventure, etc. And it turns out that the reason that the ship is there is it got stuck in the ice, and the people have died, essentially frozen to death with nothing to eat, stuck in the ice. And you find that one of the lifeboats is missing, and you actually find it not that far away, and there's like the captain and two other people in the lifeboat, and they've frozen to death.
Yeah.
And at that point, the players start to realize, okay, this is an adventure where the cold can kill us. And that's a shivers down the spine moment. I loved that. It's a really good campaign. It's not in print at the moment. I keep nagging Chaosium to re-release it, like they've done with Masks of Nyarlathotep.
Yeah.
A huge box set with all the props and so on.
I'm getting flashbacks to a book I loved as a child, Island at the Top of the World.
Okay.
And it's some dudes trying to trek their way through the Arctic, searching for somebody, and it's actually really absorbing, and I can imagine it within an RPG setting. Whenever, as part of that play, you actually have to get up to speed with how you tackle an Arctic expedition. You know, it's
being outside can kill you.
Yeah,
It's not just the mythos horrors that can kill you; it's being outside, and it's despite the fact you've got this vast expanse of wilderness. It's really claustrophobic because you can't go outside safely for most of the time.
Yeah. Oh my word! Oh
Very
my
cool.
word! I'd like to talk about collecting old RPGs. So, is there a market, or what's the market like? What's it like to be a collector of that kind of stuff? And how do you spot the gems?
I'd say that it's. I suppose I get a slightly different angle on this because I'm trying to make money out of this rather than purely collecting now.
Yeah.
Prices have definitely hardened in the last few years. There was a time, probably back when I was a collector, that you could go on eBay and you could find stuff that you were looking for, and it would be a nice, easily affordable price as a collector.
Yeah.
And RPG collecting, particularly of old Dungeons and Dragons stuff, has become more of a thing, and the quantity of old Dungeons and Dragons items has not increased on the market. The quantity of people looking to buy old Dungeons and Dragons items has increased. So simple supply and demand, prices have gone up.
So what are the kind of the really rare items to be looking out for?
Okay, if you've got any old Dungeons and Dragons in your campaign, and by old, I would say anything that was released for original Dungeons and Dragons, the one that came in a little cardboard box, usually a little white cardboard box. Anything released at that stage is worth a bit.
Yeah.
The first 3 print runs of that original Dungeons and Dragons box, we usually call it white box D&D because for the most part came in a white cardboard box. The first 3 print runs didn't actually come in a white box. They came in a really cheap, nasty cardboard box with like a wood grain effect, and we call those wood grain sets. If you've got one of those, you're looking at that's worth several thousand.
Yeah.
We had a 3rd print run copy that we sold to a guy in Norway, I think, actually. And that was in sort of average condition that went for £5,500.
Wow.
Yeah, well, there's not that many of them. If you're collecting D&D, don't you want as the centerpiece of your collection, you want the original set, and it'll look like that. I've seen first printing ones have gone for in excess of 20,000, and that's probably the top end of the rare market. There's other bits and pieces. Anything for first edition advanced actually still, has a decent value. I mean, some of the adventures might be, 20 or 30 quid, and the rule books are common, but everybody wants a first edition monster manual.
Yeah.
So, we don't have trouble selling first edition monster manuals for 30, 40, 50 quid or so, just depending on condition, even though that was a really, really common item. There are rarer things, obviously. The one that's, I think, probably the one that's at the absolute top of my bucket list of obscure D&D stuff that we've never stocked, but I would like to, is an adventure called ST1 Up the Garden Path.
Right.
And there's a bit of a story behind ST1. They always had codes for basic D&D.
Yeah.
And it's a basic D&D module, so it went with the red box set. So if you've got Keep on the Borderlands, that's module B2. B is for basic. If you've got Curse of Xanathon, that's X3. X is for expert. The ST in module ST1 stands for Stoke-on-Trent.
Oh, right. Okay.
The story is that in, I think, 1985, it would be something like that, maybe 1986, Stoke-on-Trent hosted the International Garden Festival.
Right.
Okay, which was a festival about gardening.
Uh-huh.
For no apparent reason, TSR UK, TSR being the publishers of D&D at the time, TSR UK's office had a stand there.
Right.
Okay. I don't know why, but they had a stand at the garden festival. And to commemorate this, they essentially published a D&D adventure called Up the Garden Path, which had as its map the car park and festival site. Apparently it wasn't very good as an adventure, and they sold it just at the International Garden Festival.
Right.
Now, as it turns out, there isn't much of an overlap between gardening enthusiasts and D&D players.
I get that.
There wasn't in the mid-80s, so they didn't sell many. They took some of what was left to the Games Day convention about a month later, and didn't sell many there either, and the rest got pulped. So it's really, really rare. But because it's, it looks to all the world like a regular D&D adventure, and it's got an official module code, and, essentially it's a proper official D&D adventure.
Yeah.
So all the collectors want Up the Garden Path. If you've got an Up the Garden Path, it's worth several thousand.
Wow.
And I've never seen one. I'd love to get one. I've seen a PDF, but I've never actually held one in my hands. What really bugs me now, of course, is that my mum and dad went to the International Garden Festival in Stoke-on-Trent, and they wanted me to go with them, and I thought that sounded like the most boring thing ever. So I stayed at home. I probably played D&D, actually.
So let's talk about tips for people playing or role-playing games. Well, actually, first one, I've got a question for you. How is there any tips on people to seek out a role-playing game that they'll enjoy? I just want to show something on your website here for a second, because so on your website, down the side here, you have all the major kind of role-playing games, okay? And then you have this little link here called Other Role-Playing Games, right? And whenever you click that, I thought to myself, oh, that'll be interesting. There'll be a few in here. And then it goes.
Babylon 5?
And it goes. And it goes.
About two or three RPGs for Babylon 5.
Oh, man. And there's
Ghostbusters, nice.
So, and it just keeps going and going.
I'll slow down more. I want to see what some of these are.
It's a Pokathulu.
Pokathulu. Whoa,
That
whoa.
was quite obscure, Pokathulu, and not officially licensed by
There's Sailor Moon in there. What the hell?
It's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. So, I suppose, like, I'm asking for tips, and that's only one page. There's another 28 pages of that. It's just I couldn't believe what I was seeing.
I think a lot of people don't realise just quite how many published RPGs there are now and have been over the years. And there's probably there's vastly more than we do, because a lot of them would be PDF only.
Yeah.
you get through I don't really want to mention a competitor too much, but you don't. If you go to drivethrurpg.com, there's a lot of different RPGs there. So there's an RPG out there for you, whatever you want to play.
Clearly, there really is. So, like if somebody wants to get into role playing, those first steps, have you any tips for them?
I think Dungeons and Dragons is still a pretty good place to start, to be honest. The only time I would suggest don't start with Dungeons and Dragons if you really don't fancy that whole fantasy thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so say I'm someone that wants to do role playing in, say, the Walking Dead universe. I'm sure there's probably a role playing game out there for me to get into something like that.
There's not as many zombie apocalypse RPGs as you might expect, but yeah, what would I suggest? The End of the World. FFG did a series of RPGs called The End of the World. They all use the same system, but they varied according to what caused the end of the world. So there's things like Wrath of the Gods, and one of those is zombie apocalypse, and that's probably a good thing to use.
Yeah. See, I remember those because whenever you're doing your character creation in that, you can actually create yourself and place yourself into the apocalypse, which I always thought was a really cool idea.
Yeah. So, whenever you run an RPG, what are your campaigns like? How do you approach it?
If I told you that my last campaign ran for 5 years and I think was what I would call super epic. Mm-hmm. My last campaign, and I've run a variety. I've run D&D. I've run a lot of Traveller.
Yeah.
But my last campaign was a Middle Earth campaign. Mm-hmm. Specifically, it was the Second Age of Middle Earth in the east. So off to the right of the map that we normally see.
Yes.
And the theme of the campaign was Sauron. Sauron picking those kings of men that he's going to give the 9 rings to, who will become the Nazgul. And I did that without really telling the players what the theme was. They only worked it out right at the very end, after 5 years.
Whoa, after 5 years? Actual time or in-game time?
No, 5 years actual time. And my group, because we're sort of spread out around the country, we don't play, once a week for the most part. My campaigns, we run once a year, but we do it for like 9 solid days of role playing.
Wow.
Yes.
Everybody comes down to stay at our house in Cornwall. And that's great fun. That's hardcore role playing.
That is hardcore.
It's the way to do it, though, and I think. So that epic campaign lasted 5 years, and because it's an epic Middle Earth campaign, so there should be big epic battles as well as role playing. So we mixed in some miniatures wargaming too.
Yeah.
In 6mm scale. Because I'm a strong believer that if you're going to do an epic fantasy battle, don't faff around with 28mm or anything, or you have like 10 figures on each side. Yes. You want an army that looks like an army. So 6mm scale, rows of soldiers. Did that. I use a lot of miniatures in my role playing as a rule. I'm a bit of a painter.
Yes.
I'm probably, I'd say I'm above average. I wouldn't go any further than above average, but I've got pretty good in terms of painting quickly.
Nice.
I'm a complete convert to Citadel Contrast.
I know a lot of people with you there, buddy. With you there.
Do you know what?
Yeah.
I think we're long lost brothers here, right? Because my favorite scale has changed. I haven't quite got down to 6mm yet, but I'm a complete 15mm convert. Okay. I think 15mm is the most wonderful scale, and I love it for RPGs.
15mm is for people who are too scared to go to 6.
But contrast has unlocked it. I gave up painting. Three odd years ago.
Yeah, you actually made an announcement on a video going, "I have officially retired from painting."
I officially retired from painting about 3 years ago, and then when lockdown hit. Obviously, most of us have all been having to work from home and stuff. So I set up my own my work desk, and I built myself a new LED arch light and stuff. And I thought, I'll have a go at it. And now I'm churning them out like nobody's business. Contrast paints have been wonderful.
Fantastic.
Just one coat. Whop.
And I think a lot of people react negatively to contrast paints because it's easy.
Yeah.
You can actually get pretty good results easily and quickly with, only some skill. And if you're a really, really good painter, you might possibly resent that.
Yeah.
But even if you're a really good painter, you can use it as a tool. You can. You don't just have to go plop. You're in the pot. You're done. You can actually do thin coats with it and use it as like really nice toning and stuff for your different miniatures. If you want to go that far.
I love it. My top tip for anybody that's into contrasts is buy yourself a bunch of empty pots. The empty. I use the empty little squirty pots. Right?
The dropper pot.
Dropper pots. Okay. I bought a bunch of them, and every time you buy contrast paints, make sure you pick up a bottle of the contrast medium. And then what I do is I mix my own contrast paints. I label them up, and I put a good chunk of medium in them because I find the contrast paints to be a little pigment heavy. I like I like my colors. I think by toning the colors down, by adding the medium, I can get my results. Just in one shot. So I've been gradually just building up loads of different my own custom colors, just from mixes and all kind of cut with medium, so that they're just not so strong, so as I can just slap them on. I don't even need to do any highlighting or anything after that. It just works.
That's interesting. Yeah, okay, I'll try that. Anyway, getting back to the RPG campaign, I'm also a big sucker for props.
Yes.
I love using props. So hand-drawn maps, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I like a bit of fantasy cartography.
Yes.
And I'm not somebody that wants to do it on computer. So if you go down into my living room downstairs at the moment, there's a hand-drawn map of the north of Middle Earth that I drew on Nepalese artisanal paper.
Oh,
so handmade paper, and I drew with pen and ink, and I'm quite proud of. I haven't got it to show you, but I love doing props, and the advantage of having essentially a year between role-playing sessions is essentially I have a year of prep time.
Mm-hmm. And what about
so I've got time to paint the miniatures and draw the maps and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. What about atmospherics? Do you do much with like audio and things like that?
Oh well, I must admit, I watched your session with Sirenscape, and I'm thinking, oh,
yeah,
because I've seen them at Expo in the past, and I think probably because it's a really noisy environment, I hadn't really stopped to pay much attention. There was a perfect opportunity for them to showcase their stuff with you guys, and I'm thinking, I've investigated that, and I played it to my wife, and downloaded the free stuff, and I thought, I quite like this idea. So I think Sirenscape I'm going to subscribe to.
Yeah. Nice.
So they've got at least one subscription out of doing UK Virtually Expo.
Nice.
I'll tell you what we did do, actually. When we ran Horror on the Orient Express, which is another one of those great long Cthulhu campaigns, there's a chapter of that set in the... what's the famous opera house in Milan? I can't think. But there's a chapter set in an opera house in Milan, and it's the first ever performance of Aida, the Egyptian themed opera. So I played that in the background as they were doing that chapter.
Is that the Teatro alla Scala?
La Scala, yeah, that's it. La Scala. Mm-hmm. Did you just Google that, or did you know
did.
it?
I just Googled that.
Well, the chat caught him 1 second.
People have La Scala coming up in the comments as well.
I caught him 1 second early. Thank you, chat.
Yeah. Hello, Katsama71. Yes, you're right, La Scala.
So, so you had it set in the La Scala, did you?
Yeah.
So you had the music.
The other thing we did for that campaign, one of the players in my group, one of them is a qualified master of wine. Which means in the wine world, that's like one of the top 300 wine experts worldwide.
Yes.
Okay. Really clever guy. And his wife is a really, really good cook. Mm-hmm. And she always does all the cooking for us all week, which is great. Hello, Lois. And Tony is the wine expert. So what we did for Horror on the Orient Express, because you travel through Europe, it's the Orient Express. So you start off in London and you get to Constantinople.
Yes.
Or Istanbul, not Constantinople. Is depending on where the players were in their progression, that determined what wine was being drunk by the group and what food Lois was preparing.
Wow. It's one of the wonderful things, though, about RPGs is there's so many things you can bring to the mix to just to really lock in the atmosphere. We have a few questions that have come in via the chat, Mark, if you don't mind me running over a few.
Okay.
You should be able to grab it there on the laptop. Mark.
Yeah, so one of the questions that come in is just as you as a collector, okay? Whenever you're collecting, do you like to? Are you a completionist in that sense, that you like to collect?
I used to be with Traveller. I was definitely a completionist with Traveller.
Yeah,
And I reckon Traveller probably second only to Dungeons and Dragons in just how much material was produced for it, because they license things out to third-party publishers. So there was a lot for Traveller, and I never got to 100% for the classic version of the game, but I probably got close.
Yeah,
And there's some really obscure small press publishers who probably only had print runs of a couple of hundred. So some of their stuff is really hard to get. But I had some of it, but not all. I doubt there was anybody who got 100%.
I got all of it.
I thought I was probably the only dedicated Traveller collector in the UK. I knew there was some in America. And then it was one of the hardest days of my life, the point when I decided that the Traveller collection had to go into stock in the shop, as well as all the other stuff that I'd put in stock. But I did that. And some of the obscure Traveller collectibles are probably of only very, very niche interest, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
But then on Twitter, there came the day when a very good friend of mine called, I'll just call him Timothy, who is the author of the Traveller bibliography. The day that he discovered the shop on the Borderlands, he went and bought a lot of really obscure stuff that I had in my collection that he'd never had in his collection. And he turned out to be probably the other really dedicated Traveller collector in the UK. And he's got all the old, really obscure stuff that I used to have now.
Yeah.
Hello, Timothy.
Given the sheer scale of many RPGs, they can be intimidating. How do you gently introduce a newbie without it being too overwhelming to them?
Okay, I think a lot of RPGs nowadays have good starter sets. The if you're starting with Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, I don't want to be too grognardy. I quite like old editions of D&D. But I think the 5th edition is perfectly good. I like 5th edition. I'm going to start running a 5th edition campaign. The 5th edition D&D starter set is excellent.
Yeah.
It's got a thin paperback rules booklet really, which will get you going and enable you to run your first, few dozen sessions probably. You can exist just with that paperback rulebook, and it comes with a mini campaign really called Lost Mines of Phandelver, which I think is worthy of being called a classic adventure. In the way that people like me talk about the Keep on the Borderlands or the Temple of Elemental Evil or Tomb of Horrors as classic D&D adventures, I think if we come back and have this chat in 20 years' time, I think we'll look back on Lost Mines of Phandelver as the equivalent. It's a really good introductory campaign. So I think the D&D starter set, it's less than 20 quid. I think you get a box, you get the rules booklet, you get the adventure, you get a set of dice. It's got everything you want to start off with.
Yeah.
And then, I don't want to just say D&D. If you want to start with Call of Cthulhu, the Call of Cthulhu starter set is great. So if you want to start with a horror theme, and if you want to do science fiction, I would say the Traveller starter set. The Traveller starter set is great, but it's a little bit overproduced in my view. This is it's produced by Mongoose, who do some great stuff for Traveller. They've currently got the license, British company. Hello, Matt Sprang. Matt Sprang and Mongoose is a great guy. The Traveller starter set, though, I think it's about 50 quid. So it comes with a lot of stuff and is arguably a bit too much for a starter set. 50 quid is not pocket money.
Yeah.
If you're going to start with Traveller, I would start with the Traveller Mongoose Traveller 2nd edition core rulebook, and that's a great way to start a science fiction RPG campaign.
Cool. Have you ever encouraged new players to try older editions of an RPG? And if so, how did that go? What was the reaction?
I do sometimes. And I think, probably for selfish reasons, as we're a retailer that sells old editions. Yes. there are some games where I think have unquestionably got better as they've gone on. If you wanted to start with Call of Cthulhu, I think there's no reason not to start with the current edition of Call of Cthulhu, for example. I think that's fantastic. Dungeons and Dragons, I think there will be some people who prefer the modern editions, but I think actually the older editions of Dungeons and Dragons are worth looking at. And in particular, for me, one thing I don't like about modern editions of D&D is the way that the game has sort of changed in emphasis to trying to optimize the build of your character.
Yes.
So choosing the right special abilities or feats and proficiencies, and if you mix those together, you get a really good combination. And trying to optimize a character that you build a character, roll a character up, and choose which options make you the more powerful character seems to me to be less interesting than just taking what the dice give you, having a much simpler setup, and making more effort into making an interesting role-playing character.
Yeah.
Well,
and older versions of D&D don't have that sort of optimization mechanic, because a first level fighter is probably not that different to any other first level fighter on paper.
Yeah.
The way you differentiate is in your role playing.
Yes.
Your choices.
There's more of an emphasis
how you depict the character.
Role play and slightly less emphasis on game.
Yeah. And I prefer that. So if I talk to somebody and I get the impression that that's what they would like, then I try and steer them, if they're going to start with D&D, maybe in the direction of the old red box basic D&D set, the one that was edited by Frank Menser. I still think that's as good a start for role playing as anything.
Yeah.
5th edition starter set is great. The red box basic set is also great.
We have another question. Considering the rarity of some of the stuff that would pass through your hands, certainly as a shop, but also as a collector, how do you protect it? Do you make a photocopy or a scan of it to try and make sure you keep it pristine, or?
No, it sits on the shelf.
It sits.
It sits on the shelf.
Yeah. And then one last question we have through.
I've got far too much to sort of individually scan items. that would just take decades.
What tips would you give for someone introducing a new system to their group? So I've got some context here. This group has been playing D&D 5th together now for about 3 years.
Okay.
They've decided he's going to run a new Root RPG for them when it's out.
Okay.
But it will be his.
I'm seeing a lot of buzz about the Root RPG.
Yeah, it'll be his first time DMing, and the first time anyone in their group has played a system that isn't 5th edition. So, tips for introducing a new system into the group.
Okay. Well, I think there's probably two sections to that. There's the first time DMing.
Yeah.
Everybody has to have a first time, and I wouldn't worry too much about copying your existing DM style or copying Matt Mercer or whoever. Make your own style, and I think a good shortcut, if you can do it, is always going to be NPCs with different accents. For anybody who's starting DMing for the first time, if you can make your NPCs memorable somehow by having them have different accents, I think that's a real shortcut to a memorable session. What I wouldn't worry too much about is learning all the rules.
Yeah.
It doesn't break immersion. Doesn't break immersion too much if you have to make up a rule on the spot. And don't be afraid to make up a rule on the spot. So that's a sort of first-time DM tips. The other part of that question was that your group's not played anything that wasn't D&D 5th edition before. Okay, I think probably, and going with something like the Root RPG, which is going to be a bit different, they're going to have to get a different flavour. If they've played the Root board game, you've got sort of a start there because they'll be aware of the universe and so on. And if they haven't, then that's probably a good place to start, and get them watching, films with anthropomorphized creatures. Watch Watership Down or something, just to get them in the mood. But don't worry too much if the mechanics are different.
Yeah.
In fact, I generally, my own RPGs, I tend to run very, very rules light. And I'm not one of these GMs that likes to have a rule for everything. which I think is a bit of a fault of later editions of D&D, that
Yes.
there's a bit of a rule for everything. I think, a really important skill for any GM is, can you quickly work out a rough probability and apply it to dice?
Yeah.
So, okay, the player character is wanting to do some task, and you think mentally, I want to give them about a 1 in 4 chance.
Yes.
Okay, well, maybe that's roll 1d4 and roll a 1 or something. But just do something like that. Just quickly in your head work out what the probabilities of them doing that task, and don't think, oh well, I'm sure there's probably a rule for this. I think I saw it somewhere. Let me turn to the index. There isn't a very good index. Was it in chapter 3? Don't do that. Just GM from the seat of your pants, and if you think something's got a 1 in 4 chance, give them a 1 in 4 chance. Or maybe it's not roll a 1 on a 1d4, maybe it's roll a 9+ on 2d6, but you get to add or subtract bonuses or penalties, and they can justify that. That's how I run Traveller. Traveller has got a reputation as being really, really crunchy and rules heavy. And if you turn to some of the rule books have got equations in, which really scares people. But at its heart, Traveller is, to do something in Traveller is roll 2d6 and get 8 or more.
Yeah.
Plus or minus whatever bonuses you can argue that to the GM that you deserve.
Yeah,
and that's how I run Traveller, essentially.
Yeah, so if you're trying to, say, convince someone at a trading station to give you some information, how intimidating are you, how charismatic are you, there's your bonus there.
Yeah,
exactly.
And it's on the fly. I use this similar technique with it when I'm role playing with my children. The other thing that I tend to do is I tend to break an action up a little bit, not too much, not too granular, but I'll break it into a couple of the things that you have to do to make an action happen, and I work out just the rough probabilities of each bit to see how it goes, and let them see it play out rather than it all happening in one miraculous moment. Right.
I'm just looking at the chat stream, and I want to answer a question from Sanjuro Takagi about my T-shirt.
Yes.
Sort of make that a bit more obvious.
Is this your character?
That's not a player character that I ran in Traveller. That's me.
That is you.
That's me. My stats in Traveller.
Awesome.
I probably was slightly ambitious and optimistic in my intelligence and education scores, which maxed out at F. But I went to a good university, and the only really, really good skill that I've got is Football Manager 6, which is the PC game Football Manager, which is what I spend most of my spare time on.
Here's a little side note for you.
And whoever said it was from a Kickstarter, they were absolutely right.
Yeah.
The Traveller 5 Kickstarter, when that was released, which is one of the current editions of Traveller 5, that came out originally back when I was a serious collector and had a good job, and I backed that at a, shall we say, one of the expensive levels.
Yes.
And okay, I got the T-shirt, but I also got, if you've got a copy of Traveller 5, you'll see my name as a rules example a couple of times.
Oh, nice.
Quite cool.
Claim to fame.
Also, Sanjuro Takagi, Watership Down is absolutely not an Easter film. I just isn't. At least not when small children are present.
Just bring this up. So, folks, remember, look, go and check out the man's shop. It's the shop on the Borderlands. You can find it. Let me just get the shopontheborderlands.co.uk.
Yeah, it's on screen now.
And do you know what? Go and make yourself a cup of tea before you go there, because you're going to be staying a while by the time you browse around a lot of this.
It's a big side. It's a big side.
It has been an absolute pleasure to spend time with you, man. It's been
Thank you for having me,
wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us.